right there on her spot. Hello, world. Patricia O'Connor and Frida Reba Darcy here today on the Bonsai balcony. We're going to do a pine show. Today is going to be about pines. We have currently two species of pine. Is that right? Yep, that's right. I have two species of pine. I've had three. I think that's it. I think I've had Mugo is something that I've had that we didn't get along well as roommates. My two attempts at Mugos came and went really quickly. I was also warned off of them, and I kind of found that to be true. They didn't like hanging out. But what I have now is Ponderosa, Japanese black pine. Say that 30 more times, and then the big one on the end, Japanese black pine, Ponderosa. Black pine. Everything over there in the trays and everything up high is black pines. All of these are black pines. Incidentally, it's mid-January, so all of my trees have their winter color. Nobody is doing anything other than what they're supposed to be doing this time of year, which means my black pines and my ponderosas look a little yellow, and my other stuff looks leafless. So that's kind of that kind of sets the tone for it being the final couple of our mid-January. We'll just call it mid-January. For it being mid-January, 23rd, 24th, somewhere in there. It's incredibly warm, and by incredibly, let's put a number to it. 60 Fahrenheit on the ground. I'm 4 floors up, so it's 60 plus, whatever that is. It's nice. It's sweater weather, barely, but it's sweater weather. The trees seem to be responding. They seem to be greening up. We have been in this warm spell for quite a few days, and also our days are getting notably longer. You do notice when you get off of work at 6 o'clock, when you notice when it's dark at 4:30, and then when you get off work and it's still not quite night yet. That's a welcome sight. That kind of tell. If you're looking forward to spring, that tells you that it's on its way. So getting back to the pines, and also I'm waiting for stuff to start budding out. I don't think that we're out of the woods we're in the middle of winter as far as the calendar's concerned. But right now the weather sure is warm, and that's not uncommon for us to do that. We can turn right around and find out that February is every bit the winter month that it's supposed to be. So yeah, I'm not dancing on winter's grave quite yet. But I am enjoying the nice weather while we have it. I could probably go through and start doing some needle cleanup on these guys, and that's just a little general look and convo. But let's talk about pines now. The two pines I had, as stated, are Ponderosas and Japanese black pines. Ponderosas, like this guy right here. This one is also, we can add the word Yamadori to the mix. It was collected at over 5,000 feet in Deadwood, South Dakota. It is a Ponderosa scopularum, as is this one, and would have been collected in about the same neighborhood elevation-wise, and it is also a Yamadori scopularum. All of these that are there, those are all garden grown. Those are greenhouse grown from a gardener, from a nursery grown stock, and they were very super healthy. But a Ponderosa would be in the category of a single flush, long needle, high elevation pine. More on that in a second. The Japanese black pines would be an example of a two flush, double flush, two flush, short needle, coastal, low elevation pine. In Alameda, California, where I live, the backside of that building that you can see over the top of the Ponderosa, their balcony on the backside of that building, they're looking at the water. There's nothing between. There's nothing. There's no buildings between them and the water's edge. That's how close I am to the bay. And I feel like, as well as Japanese black pines do here, I sort of feel like this is probably a climate quite a bit like the ones that Japanese black pines came from. And whenever we say that a Japanese black pine is a two flush or a multi-flush tree, what we're saying is that they have adapted in a way that will cause them to make a second flush of needles should anything happen to their current flush of needles. So, in other words, these guys have evolved in an environment where hurricanes or tropical storms, typhoons, if you will, are a possibility. And the possibility of these things being stripped bare by a storm like that means that they've adapted the ability to grow a second flush of needles. And it was discovered that if you were to do this as a practice, if you would entice that second flush of needles, that second flush of needles could be shorter than the original flush if done in a certain way. So, also, it wasn't thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago that this was discovered as a practice. I think, from what I've been told, this is a fairly new discovery in bonsai. In other words, we know of bonsai artists whose ancestor, I think, is partially responsible for this discovery. As the story goes, one of the Boone clan discovered that a beetle or a caterpillar, I don't remember what, had eaten the candle off of one of his black pines, and then noticed, because of that the tree responded by growing a flush of second candles. And ever since then, that became sort of, a practice that was publicized successfully and quite successfully used as a measure of keeping needles down to a proper length. You see, these aren't a proper length, but this was just recently put in this pot. The idea is that when you cut the candles, then the tree will respond by supplying new candles. You can cut one candle and end up with 4 quite easily. It's not uncommon at all. In fact, 4 or more, right? So then you let the tree grow out all 4 of those candles, and when it's done, all of that, and it's well and truly done with all of that, and all of the energy that it had allocated towards that second flush has been spent, then all of those candles will be shorter than the ones that came before it, because they had to divide amongst themselves a second round of energy that wasn't accounted for when the tree was throwing its banking its energy off to the side. So it compensates by making smaller needles. Then we come back through and look at, say, our 4 candles, and we cut back to 2 that we like, and that's how we increase the bifurcation. That's how we increase the bifurcation of our black pines, and that's how we get our needles small, and that's how we end up with pairs of buds that are like this. If we have a cluster of them, maybe we'll cut them back until where we have 2 like that. But what we would really prefer is to make sure we have 2 that are close to the same energy, no matter where they are. And so if we end up with 2 that are like this, then we can just wire them in the right direction. And that's kind of the idea behind that. As you can see, this little guy has been in that little peanut, that little wabi-sabi peanut container for quite some time, for a couple of years now, and its needles are coming out quite short. Whereas this one just got planted into this little bonsai pot just a few months ago, and we haven't gotten really into the process of shortening its needles yet. Although we have done our first round of candle cutting on this tree this year. This one is a couple of years in, and our needles have gotten to be quite a bit shorter. The tree's a little yellow, but that's a reflection, very much a reflection of our winter color. This has been a fun little tree to grow. It is a mame, and we cut the candle right here, and then we're rewarded with 1, 2, 3. We got 3 out of that. I will probably go back through and cut this one, and then leave that, and then leave those 2 as our growth this year. Also, something that's important to do with black pines is black pines love to get taller. I mean, their whole deal is to be a taller, bigger tree. The word for that is apical dominance. They're apically dominant. They want to be, they want to grow out here. And as they allocate more and more energy towards the tops of the ends of the tree, it becomes necessary to sometimes remove needles or remove unneeded branches. We want to take some of the dominant energy out of the top so that the tree will not be allowed. If we can manipulate it this way, this is what we're trying to do. If I allow this end of the tree to get super strong, it will come at the expense of the back end of the tree. This is the little bud that could be a nice little branch location for us. But if everything is getting super, super energetic on this end, it will come at the expense of this, and it'll kill this off in a year or 2. However, if I want to try to keep the energy in this guy going, I should probably do a little better job of cleaning up some of these back needles in here that aren't buds that are positioned in places that I like. By taking their energy, by taking those buds, I'm allowing their energy to go to other places. And if I remove some of the needles on this end, not all, and we're not trying to wreck this positive energy, but by reducing some of the needles on this, we can make sure that these guys get a fair break and don't get cast off. A pine tree will make heavy top growth, and that can come at the expense of what's going on at the bottom. I also say this because sometimes we will see where we have sacrifice branches. I could have let that bud that I cut be a sacrifice branch and let that guy get way on out here, and the farther out it would get, the fatter this trunk would get. That's kind of the purpose behind that. But I've also seen sacrifice branches that looked just as full from here, all the way up. And that sacrifice branch is trying to fatten up the part of the tree that we want to keep, and at some point we would cut that sacrifice branch off But if we allow it to have that overrun of needles, that can come at the expense of this. So when you have sacrifice branches that are allowed to go for a couple of years and you know you're going to cut them off, make sure you keep an eye on the growth back here on the bottom parts of the tree, especially those things that you want to keep, and pull their needles less and pull needles more from the stronger parts of the tree, even if you're using that as a sacrifice branch and it's going to allow it to run for a couple of years. You don't want the tree to turn into that sacrifice branch, or you're not going to be able to get rid of it because there won't be any tree below it. Then you would have to graft limbs to it or something to try to get some action going down below. So yeah, I kind of have that problem sometimes with my oaks. They would rather elongate a limb really far out, and then after a year or so, it'll start killing back the stuff that's closer in on the trunk, when we may have been allowing that thing to grow out that long just for the girth, and we didn't want to lose. We didn't want to lose all those choices that were going closer in. So that is a little bit about. After we've gone through and we've cut our candles, and then we get our 4 choices, then let's say. For me, when I cut my candles on my Japanese black pines, it's going to be in the early mid-July is when it typically works out for me. And then from a couple of weeks on, you'd be able to see those other buds coming on, and it breaks out a little cluster of them, right? So even though I know I'm going to be cutting some of those back in a little while, we just let them run. August comes and goes, September comes and goes, and all those little clusters of candles that came out where that bud site was that we cut, they're all getting along and they're all producing. So November comes around, and now those guys have finally elongated out all the way. They're locked in their little sheaths. Then you know that the needles have finally, whenever it comes time, that the needles have finally stopped extending out all the way. Then I go back, clean up all this back stuff, count look at the buds, the cluster of buds I have going. I know that they will have divided up between themselves all the energy that they had allocated for that. That's when I decide which ones stay and which ones go. And like I stated earlier, typically I'm going to try to pick some on the end that look like this. But you see the way my little finger is way smaller than this finger. This is just talking about location. This would be the perfect location. But I would also want both fingers to either look like my little finger, or I would want both buds to look like, I'd either want them both to be bigger or smaller. In other words, the size of the buds closest to the same size as one another is important. So however we end up getting that, if it ends up being 2 buds like this, then we put some wire on it and we make them like that, and we end up with 2 buds of equal strength. All things being equal, if you've got like 6 buds to chew from and you need to whittle that down to 2, and you've got 2 fat ones, 2 skinny ones, and 2 medium-sized ones, personally, I'll go with the little ones. We're in the little tree business. So you can use those, you can cut away those 4 mediums and 4 strongs and encourage the little ones, and that's just kind of like a freebie. That's kind of like a freebie in working your way towards a smaller tree. That is a quick, so after we have selected from our clusters of buds and we've cut back to our 2, this is also would be a good time to thin out the needles. I said I would clean up all of this stuff, but I didn't really give that a name. What I'm describing is this is the time when we go and we thin out our needles and we clear up our needles. Clean up our needles would be stuff growing on the bottom. Remember, we don't like stuff growing straight down or straight towards the trunk or straight up. So this would be the time. This would be the time to address that. The needles that we have coming straight out of the bottom, we can clean all of that stuff off. That's just a good time to neaten all of that up. All of this back bud stuff that's not coming from buds that we necessarily want to encourage, we would clean all of that up, and then we would look at our dominant top, and we would look at the energy that's going on down here, and try to measure how much we might want to reduce the needles on this end to make sure this end looks healthy. That is a quick rule of thumb on multi-flush pines. You can also go through here anytime and bud select. But when we do decandling, the process that's referred to as decandling, that mainly has to do with keeping needle size minimal or proportional to the size of the tree. And as I said earlier, I tend to do my candles in mid-July. On a larger tree, I would do this earlier, and on a tiny tree, I would do this later. The rationale there is the more time you give that second flush to regenerate, the longer those needles will be. The shorter time you give those needles to regenerate, the shorter the needles will be. So that's kind of that. Now, Ponderosas. I'm saying Ponderosas, I'm not saying multi-flush pines. I would have to go through my notes on white pines, and I would have to go through my notes on white pines. Also, what I just said about Japanese black pines would also pertain to red pines. And here's the thoughts on that. Japanese black pines that I just got through talking about came from the coastal area of Japan, as I led into, where they could be subject to storms, and that's why they're doing a second round of needles. Is a evolutionary adaptation that keeps them alive. That also was something that could have happened in the hills, not necessarily the coast, but in the hills, and that's where the hills would be where the red pines resided. I can't necessarily have red pines here. They don't tend to do well. They also are mixed. They tell me that these Ponderosas, I'm talking about right quick, do and do not do well here. So quite a bit of the drama of Ponderosa growing for me is a feeling like, to some extent, it's a little bit of a race against time, because I'm growing a high elevation single flush pine, long needle pine, in an area on the coast where they're not known to thrive. So I've been taking measures to do that. One thing I'm going to do for this guy, for instance, side note, is we're in the process of grafting Japanese black pine to it. And when we do that, that will make the tree better acclimated to this zone. If you have a tree, if you wanted a tree that would not, if you had a pine tree that would not grow well in your climate or your zone, grafting a species of pine tree to it that does grow well in your zone, and having those grafts take and do well and then take over the tree, would be a way that you could get around that. Whenever this tree has got Japanese black pine grafts on it, right now we have one, we need about 4 or 5 more. You might see some of the ones that didn't take, but we've got one right there, probably close to center of frame that's doing well. Come February, we're gonna add a few more. I'm so sorry, that guy came up for dinner, didn't see me. So, and that's what's going on there. This being a long needle, single flush pine, the way that is not the most desirable for bonsai. Even like this guy down here, it had not severe, but it had a lot of sun damage to the needles. So even though I'm not a big fan of cutting needles, I do that from time to time if they're unsightly or ugly looking. And the needles were out to here because it's a Ponderosa, and there was just like an area where they just were burnt red. Every needle was half burned, and I just went through and cut all that burned stuff off, and this gave us a kind of a little pixie hairdo. That's also a no-no when it comes to when it comes to getting needles shorter on a Ponderosa. are single flush longleaf species. So this guy being a single flush pine. Let's say you were the person who collected this tree and you found it hanging off the side of a mountain in the Dakotas. The size of the trunk, the part where it has a 4-month growing season, means that compared to its size, this tree might be pretty old. Also, this was probably, this was where we terminated the top of the tree. I did. The collector did. This probably was another, that was the rest of the tree, but it grew long enough to get this fat and this fat. And so they chopped it here and dug it up and then put it in a container. So when they found it, it would have been all of this time kind of 1 foot in and out of the door of trying to survive in a very, very, very harsh environment. By August, a lot of times it probably already had snow on it for some time. By October, it would have been ice everywhere. And then its growing season wouldn't have been but a couple of months. And during that couple of months, it could get 3 digits high here. So, not here, but in the Dakotas at that elevation. So it was used to a much harsher environment. And frankly, from what they tell me, is it doesn't get cold enough here and it doesn't get hot enough here. So the extremes that it pretty much normally sees never happens. And that the thing will put out a second flush when it's not, it'll put out its first flush. And then right behind that, it'll put out another flush, which is not the same as being a 2 flush. That had nothing to do with something happening to the first flush. So it countered that by it just is putting out another flush because it's not dormant. And that will lead to it dying. That would look like when these start in winter. And it says our roots are in good condition and that the tree is not in a state of dormancy. That also means that a year or 2 of that and I could lose this tree. So that's why those are important. But if we wanted for this tree to have shorter needles, if Ponderosa thrived here, and I wish it did, I would grow this as a Ponderosa. Then the object would be not to lose the Ponderosa foliage, but to make the Ponderosa foliage more believable for a tree that's this height. The obstacles to that is, as a species, these needles do not stop growing until they become 30. They just grow and grow and grow. So we don't have the window of needles coming out and then the window closing. They're fully out and extended and we can do something because of that. Nope, that doesn't work that way. If we try to do the practices where we cut back the growth that we don't like, we're making and allocating more energy to the stuff that's left, and the tree will reward that by making those needles just grow that much longer. It can just switch back on and decide we'll add another couple of inches to the length of all of those. So the way to try to get, for a tree this size, it wouldn't have to be a believable needle length. It wouldn't be a third of the, that needle is easily half the length, height-wise, of the tree or better, and that wouldn't be a believable height. But if we took that down to here, or better, anything over that or better, and we would start to be getting close to something that would be a more believable when it comes to the perception of age and size and beauty and stature and all of that we're just shrunk down into something small. And in order to do that on a single flush high elevation pine, the method is completely different than the one that I described with the multiple flush. If we were to collect one of these in the wild, sometimes we find the needles are already short and we think, and We have a beautiful Ponderosa, and for whatever reason, this thing might be a hybrid or something because the needles are short. What a lucky score. So you get this thing back, you put it in a container, you put it in a crate or a big wooden box that you've made, and you put it in some decent substrate, and you start watering it and you start feeding it, and all of a sudden the tree bounces back and gets healthy and starts enjoying the good life, and it flushes out, and everything it flushes out, those needles are 1,000,000 miles long. And you're going, hey, wait a minute, what happened to my short-haired girl here? What happened to that? Well, it was in survival mode and maybe doing well at that or maybe not, but that was one of those short needles were one of the signs that it was in survival mode. So what we're going to do is a little bit of the opposite of that. We're going to feed it. We're going to give it the water that it needs. And even though this is a high elevation pine and it takes less water than the Japanese black pine, it would probably like a little bit more water than what it's used to getting in the high elevations. Most of the water it probably gets is in the form of snow, frankly. And then when it comes to growing season, an actual growing season, it probably doesn't get a whole heck of a lot of that. So when you have one of these and you put it in a bonsai container, it's not as resistant to drought as it used to be. And that's on us. It's dependent on us. So what we're going to do is we're going to feed it and we're going to water it. We're going to give it as much water as it needs, and we're going to feed it and how will it respond? It's going to grow the needles that it has longer, and it's going to back bud. And when everybody else is going through and having candle cutting on their Japanese black pines, we do nothing. The stuff that grows out of the bottom, leave it. The multiple flush of buds on the end, leave them. All the back buds that are produced because it's now in an energy positive state, leave them. And this is a multi-year process. What it's going to do then is make all these really long needles. And those really long needles are going to photosynthesize. And that photosynthesis is going to turn into energy. And that energy is going to go down to the roots, and it's going to grow more roots over the winter. And then come spring, it's going to reward the tree with even more back buds. And you're going, hey, wait a minute, Pat. This thing is becoming a chow dog or something that can't even be seen. And all those needles. Yes, you're on the right track. Keep going. As it continues to back bud and it continues to produce more and more longer and longer needles, it's continuing to divide. All the food that you're giving it has turned in to foliage. Now we're on living off of what we got, and what we got is in a confined container. This being a training pot, this would be less useful than a bonsai pot. In this instance, the bonsai pot would be the best part of training for getting our needle length. And by the way, getting our needle length would be something that we would be more concerned with when all other parts of our tree are already in place. When we're looking at a finished tree, except for our needle length, then this guy would go down to a bonsai container, and then those practices that we're talking about would be we would take in the context that we have a confined root system and we're feeding it and watering it and everything's on us. There's not an abundance, there's what we have. And the foliage and the back buds that it would have come out with would have been a direct result of the amount of roots that filled up that smaller bonsai container and the amount of fertilizer and the amount of water that we've given it. Now we're living week to week or month to month, but it's a well-oiled machine coming and going, and the thing is completely full of buds, and those buds are completely just full of themselves with needles that are as long as Siamese cat whiskers. And then the following spring comes around, when it's done all that again and finally stops, we take up the fertilizer and we go back and we start clipping back all of that new growth, all of that overgrowth, all of that under stuff. The back buds that we want, we've let go. The back buds we don't want, we finally get to cut those. Like I said, all the underneath stuff that grows, We're going to get rid of that, and we're going to start cutting. We watched the ends of our tree get longer and longer and longer when we wanted a shorter tree. This is the opportunity to start cutting all of that stuff back. And you will have already probably seen last year that last year's needles were a little shorter than what they had been lately, and this spring's needles are going to be shorter still. That's at the point at which we have pulled up our fertilizer, cut back, and style our tree, and that will last us about 3 years, and then we will start this process over again. And that's how you get the needles shorter on a single flush, long needle, high elevation pine. So what about this guy? It would be it would be doubtful that I would get the needles down to a believable show hen height. And Mame, it's going to be whimsical. You might it might be a pretty tree, but it wouldn't necessarily be a believable tree. I don't think this process would actually get something down. This needle length, for instance, even after I cut them, it's not necessarily a believable length for this to be scale-wise a convincing small tree. I love this little Ponderosa, but that's what, when we're talking about critique, that's kind of where it's at. And in the same way that if you were to scale this up to a life-size tree, say Ponderosas can get 100 plus feet. So let's say with all those twists that we were looking at, a 60-foot tall version of this, those needles would be a story long, by comparison. So we could get that down to a more believable length with those practices, that I said. However, I'm not too concerned about that on this tree for several reasons. And those reasons are, one, the grafts that we're putting on here for Japanese black pine will take care of the needle length on its own. Two, as those Japanese black pine grafts become more and more the dominant species of foliage on the tree, so too we cut back the Ponderosa foliage. So at that point, most of this stuff is deadwood features, be they deadwood features on the floor or deadwood features on the tree. So I don't really have that so much to worry about, but the rest of these little guys, that is a practice that we will be doing. I don't really think it's advantageous to keep half-dead needles on here because they weren't consuming or doing anything else but blocking the light off of the living tissue. So that's not, I didn't really think that counts, but even if it doesn't, I'm okay with cutting away dead needles. But our practice on here as an official process is to not clean up the undergrowth, to not clean up the back buds, to allow this guy to go pretty nuts for the next couple of years. And then when it no longer has enough root mass to keep up with the needle length that it had been doing, given the amount of needles that have increased and given the amount of energy that they require, it goes, hey, I just don't have that. Y'all are all going to have to you're going to have to divide this amongst yourselves, and y'all are just it'll be a lean year for y'all lengthwise. Y'all are just going to be shorter this year. A couple of years of this leads to that, and that's when we go in and clean up, and that's when we get a couple of years of also shorter needle length, and then it'll slowly start to work its way back to longer and longer needles, and then in which case we go back in and we just start doing all of that hands off. It's kind of good. You get to just go hands off. The tree gets, instead of being 1 foot in the grave, and then getting a tree with small needles because it's just trying to keep enough energy to see if it feels like continuing another year or not. Instead of all of that, we feed it, we water it, we give it the high life, and then 3 years of the high life, and then we go back and prune. That is more sustainable than the other bonsai practice, which is also dangerous. It's kind of the old school way. Bonsai masters sometimes, and it's not, there have always been people who have always taken good care of their trees and maintained them very healthily. But there are also people who were able to get a stunted tree by doing the same thing that these guys did in the wild. And here's something else: when you go in the wild and when you're someplace where you might could collect a Yamadori tree, it's a little heartbreaking when you walk across something like this and you go, that's 6 inches tall. It's probably over 20 years old from the bark and the structure, and it probably, and you see something like that in the wild dead. You're like, 6 months ago, this would have been the coolest little bonsai, and nobody saw it in time. So, yeah, that's kind of the rules, and nobody saw it in time. Kind of goes back to that process of trying to keep something with 1 foot in the grave, and that's why this tree, at over 20 years old, is the size that it is. There wasn't a limb 3 times longer than this attached to the tree somewhere up here. It was stunted, which means any one of its 20 plus years could have been a killer. And it just kind of flipped a coin, and that came up heads that many times. So as opposed to that, the push inwards towards feeding and proper water and proper care. And sometimes we might look at trees and think about where they came from. Whereas I would say, except for the part about the hurricanes, the Japanese black pines have it pretty good. They don't tend to see a lot of freezing temperatures on the beach. You don't get a lot of snow on the beach. You do get wind. But to be a Japanese black pine is to kind of hang out with your shades and be cool about it. To be a Ponderosa is to come from a very harsh environment, and they're rugged, and they show that evolution. So that's just stuff that's to be considered. At some point, if I would like the needles to be shorter on these trees, they're already going into that process where I've stated, aside from burnt tips, I'm going through and just letting them go and not doing anything for a couple of years, and that'll be the process to get these guys to a better level. I am not expecting a whole lot there. If I wanted these guys to have a believable needle length, it would be closer to what you've seen some of our Shohan black. And this is an example. That is not a believable needle length, but that's the needle length of a tree that's getting fed. And so, yeah, those are all leading to where this tree is going. Like and subscribe if you guys haven't already. Our next drops will be our Saturday shows. We've got probably a nice weekend coming up. The weather seems to be taking a little swing for the better, and I appreciate you, and Frida appreciates you. I'm gonna drop some links to some videos that most of my information came from. Expect them to be, I think, mostly Bonsai Mariah videos from their in public domain. So I'm not really publicizing his paid-for classes. These are in public domain, and yeah, we just kind of let those guys. I'll show those, and they're a little longer, and they can say in more detail the little nuances to multi-flush versus single flush, and the part where I didn't go in to white pines. I'm not exactly sure how much of that process about that pertains to Ponderosas would be applicable to white pines, but I will include a link to white pine procedures too. I don't know a whole lot about white pines because I can't grow them here. Same with red pines, and possibly the same with the Ponderosas. But I've been told no and yes, so I'm kind of trying to hedge my bet both ways while dancing with the devil a bit, I guess. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for watching.